Hello, everyone. This is Matt Myers, Dean of the Cox School of Business, and welcome to the Texas Economic Forum. You know, the Cox School of Business, we take very seriously our role in the assistance of the growth of Texas, and particularly of North Texas and the DFW area. And the Cox mission is to contribute in any way we can to that growth. And we're very proud of the fact that we're a part of a very resilient economy here in Texas, and one that I think is going to bounce back pretty quickly from the current shocks that we're experiencing. Spent a lot of time talking to a number of local business leaders, and while the recent economic news from Texas certainly hasn't always been good, I do believe that the business-friendly environment that we have here in the state will help facilitate a faster recovery than other areas inside of the country. And at the Cox School, one of the things we're very proud of is the teaching and the emphasis on free markets and economic freedom in a business-friendly environment, and how that assists all aspects of an economy and a society as well. And so we're dedicated to the proposition that teaching free markets and how those work and how business leaders are responsible for maintaining that free market philosophy inside of their economies. We're very proud of that here at the Cox School. And I'm also very proud, I should note, of how we've responded at Cox and at SMU at large relative to what's happened with the coronavirus and the crisis that we felt here. I think that one of the things that really makes me proud to be the dean is the fact that I'm affiliated with faculty and staff who have done a phenomenal job in transitioning our curriculum, a lot of it to online in a very short time, and in a way that delivers an incredible quality of instruction to our students. And I think that while we miss our students here on campus and we can't wait till they get back, one of the things that's been great to see is the fact that we ourselves are resilient, and we walk the walk as well as talk the talk here at the Cox School about making sure that flexibility and resiliency stays inside of everything that we do. And the importance of what the O'Neill Center does and how the O'Neill Center plays a part in the future of the Cox School, and really kind of the strategy of understanding what business education can do as it contributes to local economies. I can't underscore that enough. And so I'm very appreciative that you all are joining us today. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for being a part of what we're doing, because without these connections with the business community, really a business school's veracity is always questionable. So for us, it's extraordinarily important. So with that, let me turn over the program to Mike Cox, Dean Stansel, and Rick Alm. And please enjoy the forum, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My name is Richard Alm, and I'm in the O'Neill Center. I'm being joined by two of my colleagues, Dean Stansel and Mike Cox. This is our 8th Texas Economic Forum, and when we were planning for the spring event a couple of months ago, we had no idea that we would be talking about this kind of topic. It seems to me we have the worst of two historical events going on at the same time. We have the 1980s oil bust that hit the Texas economy hard. Well, the rest of the country did very well, and the Great Recession, which hit the rest of the country rather hard, but the Texas economy wasn't too badly hurt. So first things we'd like to talk about is get an assessment of how much damage has been done so far. Just want to remind everyone that the data is scarce and changing every day, and we're not anywhere near have a complete understanding of what's going on. So, but Mike, how do you view the state of the economy right now?
Well, unless you're over 90 years old in America today, you're witnessing the deepest recession we've had in your lifetime. In terms of employment, certainly, hopefully not in terms of GDP, but we hope that it's short. Depth is one thing, but length is another. And we had the Great Depression lasted 4 years and was 25% unemployment rates. We will seem to be approaching unemployment rates at the national level, which are in the 15 to 20% range but we hope and believe that it'll be short term and over and will be growing again by first quarter of next year, if not sooner. Texas, I don't think will see as big a recession, neither as a nation, even despite the fact that we're a oil-based economy and we hit the 1-2 punch. But we won't. I don't even think it will be as bad as our recession that we experienced in the 1980s, because the state was a lot more dependent upon oil back then. But the main reason I think Texas will fare better, and we should come back to this later, is that we're a very free market state, as the dean said. We're able to take a licking and keep on ticking. We're very adaptable and free market oriented.
Dean, what about?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
in terms of the damage done, look, I think that picking up on what Mike said, an important thing to keep in mind is this is basically a self-imposed recession. We deliberately hit the pause button. And so once we put it back on play, I think that things will pick back up with a lag, of course. But yeah, the damage is big. The 14.7% unemployment rate that came out for April, well, that's going to be bigger in May, of course, and we're going to see kind of depressing numbers that come out. But ultimately, I think that in the end, as I said, this is something we had to do. We could argue that point, I guess, because of the public health crisis. But another thing to keep in mind, right, going into 2020, we were in the midst of essentially the longest expansion on record. So just by the odds, we were kind of due for a recession. Now, this didn't come about because of bad economic conditions per se, but I think in some ways we were overdue for a recession anyway. So if we can have a quick one and get it out of the way, maybe we can go on to the next longest expansion.
I think one of the things about this episode is that the impact in certain places, the airlines, the retailing, the hospitality, even healthcare took big hits. Whereas there's other parts of the economy that are still functioning rather normally because of the ability to work remotely, to work from home, and to maintain some of the economic activity, and that will certainly help Texas. But I also think we need to, again, the oil part of it is that here up in DFW, that's not as important it is as in Houston, even though Houston's rather diversified these days. But then out in Midland is where the real pain of that is. So,
and I'd like to throw in something here about economic policy. Those of you who know me that know that I worked for the Fed for 25 years, Rick there with me for a long time too. And the entire time I was there, I was not a big advocate of Fed policy because I felt that the Fed was always little too late or pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical, out of step with the economy. Didn't even understand. I didn't think back then this new economy we're building, which is the high-tech economy. However, this time, for the first time ever since that I've been either a part of a Fed or witnessing what they're doing, I'm really supportive and very impressed with what the Fed is doing. I want to say something. I want to tell you why. First of all, the Federal Reserve was not created to be a dealer in government bonds. They were created in 1913 to introduce money into the economy through buying commercial paper. That's called the real bills doctrine. They would go into parts of the country that were growing rapidly and needed funds. Funds didn't transfer very quickly from one part of the country to the other. And so the Fed would go in there and buy the commercial paper, which takes some of the debt off the market. And like logging the big trees in a forest, it gives room for the little trees to grow. We have not done that since the Fed has not done that since the Treasury co-opted the Fed in the early 1900s to sell government bonds. And the Fed never went back to that. It became a dealer in government bond markets all the way up until the Great Recession, when the Fed finally started buying some private entity debt and introduced things like maiden land and so on. But today, it is incredible what the credit markets that the Fed is going to shore up. They're in the BAA, the investment grade corporate markets. They're buying they're buying commercial paper. They're buying consumer debt. They're buying municipal debt and so on to keep the economy humming and keep the economy liquid. So the big mistake that the Fed made in the Great Depression, they're not making now. And I think they learned a lot from the Great Recession as well.
Now, Dean, is there anything that can be done on the state level, or what can be done on the state level to either reverse or at least make this current episode a little less painful?
Yeah, I definitely will address that, and I'll bow to Michael's superior knowledge of the Fed, but I do want to just briefly address an alternative view of what the Fed has done really over the last 2 years or so. In times of economic expansion, in my view, and in the view of others, they engaged in excessively expansionary monetary policy, got interest rates down close to zero. And I think the analogy that makes sense for me, at least, is that if you know an enemy is coming, in this case, the enemy is an inevitable recession eventually, you probably shouldn't use up all your ammunition before the enemy gets there. And I feel like that's going to make it harder for us to respond when we hit a recession, which of course we have essentially now. And so although I'm not an advocate of activist monetary policy in general, I think that there's criticism all around. I don't disagree with what Mike said. They've done some good things. But anyway, so back to Rick's question about the states. Look, certainly in any time, whether it's a public health crisis, an ordinary economic recession, or in good times even, it's easier for economic activity to expand when there's fewer burdens and hurdles in the way, right? So we at the O'Neill Center kind of specialize in measuring what we call economic freedom. And so I work on a report that ranks the states on this. Our director, Bob Lawson, and Ryan Murphy work on one that ranks the countries. And so Texas, we have several advantages going into this, in the sense that we rank fairly high in terms of the level of economic freedom, or the flip side of that is the kind of small level of government interventions in the economy. And so we had a pretty strong economy going in, and we're going to probably have an easier time coming out because we don't have the burdens in the way of economic activity that a state like California or New York does. And so I think that we have that built-in advantage. By the way, one of the big advantages we have, there's about 7 states that don't tax personal income. Well, personal income taxes are one of the most volatile sources of revenue. And of course, one of the things that's happening in states' capitals now is that, well, the revenue faucet kind of turned off, right? But you still need to spend money. And so given that income taxes are more volatile than others, we don't have that problem here in Texas. And so that's an advantage we have moving forward to be able to get out of this recession and perhaps in a quicker fashion.
I think I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about what we all want is recovery. I think one of the things that's important to note is that Texas cannot recover on its own. It is going to be very dependent upon what happens in the national economy and the global economy and outside of the state, because particularly apropos the energy industry, it's a demand problem. And unless economic activity starts picking up elsewhere, Texas oil companies are going to continue to hurt. The other thing, of course, is that this is the medical problem, whether there's advances in treatments, vaccines, and other things that are coming along. Do either one of you have the nerve to guess about how much longer this is going to last and when recovery will start, and particularly in Texas?
Well, let me say a little bit here. First of all, like Rick said, when we opened up this entire presentation today, real-time data is very difficult to get. The most up-to-date data we can get at a kind of a local level on things like the unemployment rate among workers covered by unemployment insurance, which is 90+% of all workers are covered, shows a great diversity in unemployment rates across the country. In California, on the weekend, this is the most recent data, I'm sorry, on the week ending May 2nd, California had nearly a 28% rate of unemployment among workers covered by unemployment insurance. And at the bottom of the other end of the spectrum was Florida, for big states with a 5.3% unemployment rate. Texas was about 9%. If you look at all the 15 biggest states across the nation, Texas ranks second in terms of having the lowest unemployment rate already, as you know, this COVID and oil-induced recession that we're having. And that's with us being, you know, having the oil sector in pain too. So we're doing very, very well. And you'll generally see that the states, I got a chart right here, I'll just look at it. The states which are having difficulty, having so much unemployment right now are number 1, California, number 2, Michigan, then Pennsylvania. Fourth is Georgia, then New York, Washington State, that's the Boeing, I suppose, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, and so on. So of the 15 biggest states, we're doing second best, with Florida only beating us. We're doing really well. So I don't think it's going to take as long for us to recover as the nation. And it didn't for the last few recessions. Rick and I have written some pieces that we published in DCEO magazine about that, where it shows that Texas has historically, over the past several recessions, not had as deep a recession nor as long a lasting one.
Okay, so I guess I'll pick up from that. You know, part of the problem here, as Mike said, is the lack of data, but also the uncertainty with essentially what we're waiting for is a medical treatment for COVID-19 or a vaccine to prevent it. And those things take time. Now, I think that in part, those things take time because of hurdles that the FDA puts in the way and the CDC. And so there are ways that we can shrink that time frame if policymakers are willing, but ultimately we're kind of held hostage to the presence of a treatment. And so because not just pragmatically, but because people are fearful of going out and interact, some people at least, interacting with people. And if no one's if fewer people are gonna go out and go to restaurants and movie theaters and bars, then the economic damage will continue. So until we have some certainty there, and none of us here can predict when that will be, right? But ultimately, you know, just one reform that a couple states have experimented with is called right to try, where essentially we say, all right, sure, FDA, you have your role to assure that this is safe and effective, but I'm a terminally ill patient. I should have the right to try this experimental drug because it might save my life. Sure, it might kill me, but I'm about to die anyway. And so I think an expansion of right to try laws would be in order here and would be helpful to people, could save many lives.
We've already sort of hinted at the role of economic freedom in Texas. The shorthand for that is the Texas model, which includes low taxes, lighter regulation in product markets and labor markets, and allowing companies in the private sector to do most of the deciding on who works and what we produce. As far as I haven't seen anybody who's within the state, at least, who's challenged, who's suggested that the Texas model is ill-equipped to handle this. I think the dean both deans have already said, Dean Myers and Dean Stanzel have suggested that as we recover, the Texas model will help us recover a little faster. What I want to ask you guys is, what is it about economic freedom that makes recovery speed up?
So I guess I should pick up on that one. And the general idea is that when government restrictions on economic activity are kept to a minimum, you get more economic activity. And that's what we try to do when we measure economic freedom, is try to put a kind of a numeric value on the level of government restrictions in state economies and national economies and that sort of thing. So I think that's why Texas is well positioned. If you look at the 4 biggest states, both Texas and Florida have a distinctly different model from New York and California, where more government and more government kind of managing of the economy is kind of the way they operate. So we're in good shape in that regard. One thing that Texas has done that some other states have done, California actually hasn't done bad on this, is that in good times, states have states have rainy day funds, and in good times, the fiscally prudent thing is to put some of that growing revenue pool in, essentially save it for a rainy day. And Texas has done very well in this regard, and that means that when you hear all these calls for a federal bailout from states like New York who have done poorly, they're essentially asking taxpayers in states like Texas, in Florida, and other states that have been responsible to bail them out, and to essentially that would encourage over the long term more fiscally irresponsible behavior. The rainy day fund balances going into the last recession on average were about 4.8% of spending. To this recession, we were at about 8.4%. Texas was at 12.9%, so way above that. Illinois and Kansas had literally zero monies put aside for a rainy day. New Jersey and Pennsylvania had only about 1% of their annual budget, and New York, Arkansas, and Kentucky had only about 3%. So Texas has been fiscally prudent, and that's another way in which we are well positioned to come out of this recession.
So I want to come back to the question about what is it about economic freedom that makes recoveries happen faster. Since the first time we started collecting data on national GDP, which was 1854, America's had 34 recessions, each for a different reason, and we've had I guess this is the 35th one, we've had 34 recoveries. What makes the economy recovery? Is it government policy? Not really. The government policy can help, but most of the time comes from the simple desire of individuals to get up and make a better life for themselves and their family, and having incentives to do so. People have incentives. If you get to keep most of what you earn, and you have the freedom to make choices about where you work and so on, then what makes a nation great? All these economic activity. You get a job in a field where there is high demand, get an education, save your money, invest, take business risks, start companies, hire people, invent, innovate. All the things that lead to GDP come mainly from the 320 million of us, not from the relatively few policymakers. Now, economic freedom gives you much more of an incentive to do those things. And Texas being after the last 20 years or so, Dean would know this better than I, among the 5 most economically free states in the nation, sometimes number 1, number 2, never falling out of the top. We maintain a legacy of economic freedom, which causes people to move here all the time from all these other states. Texas has been by far the number 1 recipient of immigrants from other states, double the second most state. California has seen the most people leave, and New York second, and it's exactly for the reasons we're talking about. People can come here and through self-determination, and just they can make a better life for themselves and their family.
On that migration bit, I just want to throw in another piece here. One of the best ways to look at the relative attractiveness of areas is to look at U-Haul rates, right? And I haven't done that this year, but I know in previous years, for example, you could compare what does it cost to rent a U-Haul to move from Dallas to LA versus from LA to Dallas. Well, it turns out it costs a lot more to rent a U-Haul to move from LA to Dallas, because there's so many more people fleeing Los Angeles and California in general, and so few people trying to get back. So it makes a difference in that sense as well, and certainly Michael's right on point on that.
And Rick, I know you kept up with new corporations moving in.
Anyway, there's two economic freedom points I want to make is, first of all, when this economic downturn is getting out of it is going to require a lot of new ways of doing things, because again, as Dean mentioned earlier, that some people, you might have to adjust to the fact that people are afraid to fly, people are afraid to do things, people don't want to go to work anymore. And so there's going to, and what a freer economy allows companies to make these adjustments a lot faster and a lot easier, and that because flexibility is really important when the economic terrain shifts under your feet. The second thing is an appreciation of economic freedom helps you avoid some of the really bad things you can do during an economic emergency. And for instance, you can, one of the things you sort of hear is that there's a feeling we should turn inward in the United States. We should not trade as much. We should abandon some of the long supply lines and things like that. Now, if that's good business, that's fine. But if it's imposed upon, on the country, it'll make us less efficient. And so, economic freedom allows you to avoid some of the worst policy mistakes that you can make, and many of which were made during the Great Depression, where you had trade policy were terrible, and one of the things they tried to do was keep prices up rather than let prices fall. Michael?
Well, where do I begin on this? Let's see. Rick is right that if we, in order to have a quick recovery, we first need to get either an effective treatment. It's one thing, vaccine going to take a while, but a treatment, something that works, probably, possibly, and hopefully not as long, to find a treatment that works for COVID, so people feel safe going back into the congregation economy. But I think I sense, I'm not sure, and I certainly can't prove it, that something else is happening that's to the American mindset, for better or for worse. And that's that as the damage mounts from us shutting the economy down, at first we say, okay, we'll go home for a while, we'll shelter in. And then now we're having the effects of this, which you would expect to have, huge rates of unemployment, huge government bailout programs. And, now it's the trade-off between the economy and health is starting to become very apparent. And I think a lot of folks who for years and years and years have thought that life was always going to be very safe are beginning to realize things that our great-great-grandparents knew, that there are many, many risks in life. I mean, they grew up with the scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, malaria, every kind of disease imaginable, and they still went out and worked. And when America was becoming the land of the automobile from 1900 to 1920, we had so many deaths on the road from people driving, yet we didn't shut the automobile industry down, that if we had that same death rate today at the number of miles that we drive today, over 1 million people would die every year on the roads. Now, it's more like 50,000, 1/20th of that today. But my point is that our ancestors, which lived with things like this, their mind changed because of it, and they realized, I just simply have to go to work. We're wealthier as a nation today, but and so we can afford to stay home. But once this damage starts showing up, I think you're going to see people willing to take more risk. It's just we can't do this to the economy every time a new virus comes out. I've talked to people in the medical industry who are seeing, it's even hurting the medical industry dramatically. We can't kill an economy every time a new virus comes out, and there will be more. And we simply have to find better ways of dealing with this.
Yeah, Mike's right about the risk aspect. And also his point about the medical industry, to me, is interesting in the sense that you'd think, well, in a public health crisis, they'd be doing great. But because so many places, wisely at first at least, said, your non-essential surgeries and procedures are suspended. You can't have those. So many hospitals are bleeding money and laying off workers in the midst of a public health crisis. Now, thankfully, a lot of states have reversed those, and they've seen that, okay, we can do both. But ultimately, if you have people missing out on cancer screenings and cancer surgeries, people are going to die because of that too, right? And death is death, and risk is risk. We have risk in everything we do. And so I think we ought to learn from our mistakes. Another mistake I think that we made at the federal level is the $2.2 trillion CARES Act that was passed a few weeks back. And now they want another one, of course. But look, this thing was hastily thrown together. It was sloppy legislation. It sent checks to people who hadn't missed a paycheck. It established a $600 a week bonus for unemployment compensation. Put workers in the uncomfortable situation where if their employer calls them back, they have to say, well, I can go back to work and risk getting sick and make less money, or I can stay at home and make more money. And through no fault of their own, most of those people, of course, made the choice to stay home. But that's not the right way to deal with what we have here. We have companies that are trying to stay alive, and we're making it harder for them, not easier.
I personally know people of the type that Dean is talking about, who they called me and said, I kind of finally see what you were talking about, Dr. Cox. I'm having a difficult time keeping an incentive to go back to work because I'm making more money from the government, being on unemployment compensation that I was making at my job.
Yeah, we get the impression that a lot of these spending policies were just thrown together without sufficient thought. We have a question from one of our listeners, and about he notes that the importance of Mexico to the Texas economy, and so we ought to at least think about whether some of the ties that Texas has been building with Mexico are going to be broken because of this viral episode. As many of you probably don't know, Mexico is being hit very hard by the virus, and the reporting on it's been very lax, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going on down there, and so you have a whole bunch of companies that are facing a difficult time of maintaining their supply lines and supply chains. In addition, the border has been virtually closed particularly to personal travel, but probably some difficulties in moving goods too. And so, if Mexico were to go into a crisis, the worst yet, it's a telemarketer. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So anyway, Mexico's the worse things happen in Mexico, the worse it is for Texas. Is probably right. And then we weren't necessarily very happy with. Many Texans were very happy with the current administration to start with down there in Mexico. Mike?
Mexico trades more with Texas. The state of Texas imports more from us than they do from any other country. We trade more, we import from Mexico more than any other state. So, and more than a country. So we are extremely dependent here in Texas on our relationship with Mexico, which has been improving over the years, but recently has come under stress, not just from COVID, but from all the anti-immigration rhetoric has not been good for us. We saw a reversal in immigration over the past couple of years. There's been an outflow of Mexican immigrants who lived in Texas, who lived in America, back to Mexico. Texas happened to gain some of the Hispanic population from the rest of the country who moved here, so we didn't suffer as much as the rest of the country did. But it has hurt our state, particularly our construction industry, to see a lack of workers that we depended on for so many different sectors. Now, I think most people know that the sector that's being hurt the most right now is the entertainment, recreation, leisure, arts, and accommodation hotel sector. That's just in big decline, and that's where a lot of our immigrant workers are employed, and it's been very difficult for them. And it's certainly difficult and then they can't make remittances back home, which doubly compounds the problem that Mexico is having.
All right, so we have had quite a rush of questions here. So let me just throw things out, and anybody can jump in. Either how will U.S.-China trade policy impact the Texas economy?
Well, I think, you know, everyone, I think most people know that the sector that's being hurt the most right now is the entertainment, recreation, leisure, arts, and accommodation hotel sector. That's just in big decline, and it's been very difficult for them. And I'd like to jump in here briefly because it kind of ties into the previous question. And if we'd had this event 3 months ago, I would have said that one of the things leading us closer to a recession is the anti-consumer, anti-U.S. producer trade war that we're engaging in, and that stuff makes it harder for consumers to buy affordable goods, and it makes it harder for producers to get their supplies at a low price that allows them to keep those prices low. So yeah, anything in that regard, in terms of policies that restrict the movement of goods across borders, is going to make it harder for profits to occur and for businesses to expand. So I've seen some good signs of some of this being relaxed perhaps during the pandemic, but ultimately, yeah, we have misguided policy in that regard, and it's going to have a cost, to continue to have a cost to our economy, both in Texas and in the country as a whole.
Well, labor tends to turn every crisis into a cry for moving American manufacturing back home. It happened with 9/11. It's been happening for years that they want to stop our outsourcing and our offshoring of work to abroad. And they're not missing an opportunity this time to say the same thing. And so a lot of companies are feeling the pressure to change their supply lines to being much more domestic, which will, of course, mean there'll be a more American manufacturing, but it will also mean the prices of things will be higher that we produce here, which will make us less competitive on export markets. So, free trade has very, very few advocates on the supply side. The advocates come on the consumer side who want and that's what we are. Ultimately, we're all consumers and we want low prices and abundance, whereas producers would prefer to have a monopoly and scarcity and high prices. And so when you come down against free trade, you're coming down on the side of scarcity and not abundance.
To what extent is the current crisis a solvency crisis or a liquidity crisis? And
excellent question. To what extent is the current situation a solvency crisis and not a liquidity crisis? I would say it's mainly a liquidity crisis. Well, the Fed is solving the liquidity crisis. What we have to figure out, what the Fed is, a lot of businesses in America were already in decline, had peaked, and we were changing our economy away from more and more every day to a digital economy. And there's been a rush to do that today, which I think we will see continuing to happen. If you go to Best Buy today, the stores are empty, but not empty with people, empty with merchandise. If you want to buy a bicycle today, you're going to have to wait several months to get it because there's been several, so many people are out now engaging in family activities, such things like that. So the world, America's changing, and I think it's changing by how much I don't know, but in an interesting way, I believe, to make us be much more comfortable working at home, living at home, and then much more comfortable with the digital world and functioning in the digital world. We're going to be doing that in teaching and so on. So parts of the economy are going to, the ways we were going anyway, are going to continue to grow. On the other hand, let's pick another industry, which I think possibly has peaked, and that's the oil industry. There are three attacks on the oil industry. One is low prices from excess production and the fact that, Russia and Saudi Arabia have to produce because they have fiscal deficits to give all the population a bunch of free stuff. But then the second thing they have is the attack coming from the global energy haters. Not the energy haters, but the carbon haters. But then they also have the rise of alternatives, which are becoming very competitive. Solar photovoltaic is becoming very competitive as a way of generating electricity vis-a-vis natural gas. So I think some industries are going to peak. And so what we're going to have peaked, and we're going to see what looks like, what would have looked like tomorrow, 20 years from now, happen much closer in time.
I think that Michael's example of the bicycle industry is a good one in the sense that it's a good example of an industry that's thriving. You have these local bike shops that are having a hard time keeping inventory in. But to address the bigger question that Michael has already addressed quite well, I just want to add to that one thing that, instead of using basically taking a helicopter and throwing money out across the country, one of the solutions that was proposed by an economist named Arnold Kling, and if you want to look up an article by a guy named Tom Giovanetti, who's actually the head of Institute for Policy Innovation here in the DFW area in the Wall Street Journal. The idea was that you would, rather than giving money to everyone, establish a federally backed line of credit for everyone. And only those who needed it would take advantage of it. And yes, I think there is a liquidity problem. Sure, if you run a business and all of a sudden you've been told you got to shut down, revenues have stopped, costs haven't. And so how do you make that bridge between now and the end of this self-imposed recession? You need liquidity. You need money to be able to, because let's think about if this worked correctly and individual businesses were able to keep paying their workers. You don't need unemployment compensation. You don't need these dole outs of checks to every single person in the country. That solves the problem in a simple and less costly way. Unfortunately, we didn't go that direction.
Dean, you're so right, and thank you for correcting me on that. There is a bit of a solvency problem and a liquidity problem because we simply don't know how much some of these businesses are going to be worth in the future. Capitalism is a constant process of out with the old and in with the new, but in with the new requires investors to be willing to invest in a company to recapitalize it. Bankruptcies are a natural part. There's going to be a lot of bankruptcies. It's a natural part of capitalism. The current set of investors lose their money, but if the business is worth keeping and opening back up, the new investors come in. But right now, we don't know whether I should restart this restaurant or not. And I can't make it until the time I figure that I have to shut down now. So the Fed, I think I overspoke about just how much of this problem the Fed can solve. The Fed can help with it, but with the edict coming from government that we can't engage in activity in certain ways, it makes it virtually impossible for this not to be a liquidity crisis for many parts of the economy.
All right, Michael, a questioner asks about whether there might be some long-term impacts of the Fed's current economic policies, and I presume in terms of taking on all that debt.
Okay, well, there's something I'm not sure many people know, and I want to make sure that everyone does. The Fed has to return all of its profits to the Treasury. When the Fed buys something, even if it's government securities, they earn the interest on those government securities, and the interest on that has to be returned to the Treasury. And historically, over the 107 years of the Fed has returned nearly 100% of all the revenues that they've got, including profits from transactions in foreign exchange and profits from selling some of the things that they bought during the Great Recession had been returned to the Treasury. Now, what does that do? It means that it actually keeps our tax bill down. There's revenue that shows up from the Fed, which doesn't have to come from taxpayers. Okay, so essentially, you might say this is an odd way of looking at it, but essentially what the Fed has is owned by the public. It's not owned by government. Now, when the Fed bought a bunch of things during the Great Recession, they eventually started to sell it all, and everything they've sold at a profit. I expect the same thing will happen now. What we're seeing is that, so imagine somebody imagine everybody in DFW had to sell their house, 20% of the population had to sell our house overnight. All right, what would happen to the price of houses? It would just drop to the floor. Not only of the houses that had to be sold, but everybody else's too. The markets would seize up. Nobody would be able to borrow to buy a house because the value, it just would wreak havoc on markets. But that house in the long run, say by the time the year is up, would go back to a normal market value if you didn't have to dump it on the market and sell it all within a day. That's essentially what the Fed is doing. They're going into these companies and they're buying the debt at fair market value, not overpaying it for it, but not lowballing it, so that the markets stay liquid, and then they'll take that stuff and sell it back to the economy later on. Now, some of it won't be worth as much because the economy is going to change. You know, airline industry, how much is it going to be worth in the future? How much are people going to fly? We don't really know. So there'll be some losses and there'll be some gains, but what the Fed is doing is essentially propping up markets in a very important way.
And of course, bailing out investors, which
not always.
Which helps explain why the stock market is doing so well.
They're supporting. You're right. They're supporting industries that they think have a viable long-term future.
We hope. One of the things you hear about commentators often say about this recession is that a lot of things will be different when we come out of it. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And what we're going to do is, I think we're going to go just talk about some of the trends that may accelerate, things that were already underway, and then some that might reverse, and that some new ones that may emerge. And I'll invite those of you in the connected to this to send a message on the message thing here, and you can throw in your suggestions and thoughts, and we'll read them out if we get some. But for instance, is that brick and mortar retailing was being eclipsed by the internet already, and it seems to me that this would be a time when more people are going to start shopping online, and which is going to be very difficult make a difficult situation for many of the old line retailers even worse. JCPenney already declared bankruptcy, Neiman Marcus, and things like that. So this seems to be accelerating.
Well, I think, Rick, you pointed out the number one spot where we're going to see changes in retailing. And that change was already underway, and it's going to continue in force, I believe. I think Americans are, when I leave my house and go out and walk around, I see so many people out, entire families out enjoying being with each other. Everybody's got a new bicycle, and I think that this is having an effect on the American psyche. I can't prove it, but I see it everywhere. And those of us who have spent time in Europe over there and seen the different lifestyle, to me, it's more what I feel is a more European lifestyle coming to America. By how much, I don't know, but certainly by some. More leisure time, and a little bit less emphasis on the GDP. And man doesn't live by GDP alone.
And of course, to some extent, this slowing down and leisure is being forced upon many people.
Right, and so I think that to take the other side of that slightly is that once things go back to normal, however you define that, where people are actually going to their jobs full time, you're not going to see as much of that. The people are taking advantage of this time to, as Mike said, spend time outside with their family in the neighborhood, and I've seen that as well, and I've done that as well, and I think it's a not to bright side things, but that's one of the bright sides of this. And maybe there'll be some persistence in that trend over time. It'll certainly have to diminish some once people go back to working. Another trend that I hope will continue is that certainly the retail thing you covered well, and we've been heading in that direction anyway. But there have been a number of examples where harmful regulations have been temporarily suspended. The one that comes to mind for me is the restaurants and bars being able to sell cocktails to go. There are others with telemedicine and that sort of thing. But ultimately, look, if these things are so unimportant that we can suspend them in order to help these restaurants and bars continue to bring in some revenue, maybe we ought to get rid of them entirely. I would say we should, but at the very least, we ought to have an exercise in debate over this as to whether these unnecessary regulations could just be gotten rid of entirely, and freeing up the economy, freeing up entrepreneurs to be able to more effectively serve their customers.
Also, of course, we would expect to see the move replacing people with machines should accelerate because, well, one of the things that machines don't get sick. And so, if you can run a retail establishment, say a fast food restaurant with kiosks rather than counter personnel, you might move a little faster on that.
Now, Rick and I wrote a report for those of you who haven't seen it last year. We published an annual report for the O'Neill Center last year. It was on big business. And it was on the topic of how America, over the past 3 decades plus, has become more and more oligopolistic with a few large firms dominating industries because they're increasing returns to scale in production. Most production has changed to being high fixed cost, low marginal cost. Now, when that comes to the airline industry, what you're going to see, and that Rick was the one who made this point to me the other day, what you're likely to see is air travel become more of a luxury good for people. Or fewer people travel, say, in the business sector. But if fewer people travel, given the high fixed cost nature of the airlines, what you're going to see is higher prices on average there. And wherever in the economy, we had been relying on quantity to lower the average fixed cost of bringing something to market. Wherever we have been relying on large volume of consumption to keep prices down, you're going to see prices go back up. And we could have about this of a little bit of inflation as we come back out of this, especially if there's if the money awash in the system, if that's allowed to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of with the airlines and travel is for the last 40 or 50 years, there's been a great democratization of travel. It used to be that a normal median income family would not be taking trips to Paris in the 50s and 60s. And of course, now they were at least before this pandemic, because of it became affordable. And the issue is whether at a certain, if they have to have fewer people on a plane, then the flight becomes less affordable per person. And the first person they want off is the people who got the cheapest seats. So business travelers will be coveted as always. We have a little question. The gist of it is that during times of existential threats like depressions, wars, pandemics, you often get a lot of innovation. Dr. Cox and I did something a decade ago or so about the 1930s, and we found a tremendous amount of innovation in supposedly the worst time in the nation's economic history. Will we see a very innovative economy, particularly here in Texas, as we recover and we look for new solutions to finding what consumers want?
I think that one way in which you can see that in the world around you, or at least I've seen it, is that you've got lots of entrepreneurial people coming up with creative new business ideas, allow them to thrive in this current environment. One of the things that I've seen, I don't know, maybe coincidentally, multiple times in my neighborhood is these huge signs, series of signs people put in their yard for happy birthday or happy graduation, congratulations. And, it's trivial maybe perhaps, but it's something, and they existed before the pandemic, but you're seeing a lot more of it where people can pretty easily kind of produce that stuff on their own, advertise it, get someone to buy that service from them, and it's there for 24 hours, taken down, can be used again. That's one example, maybe not the best example, but certainly those who are entrepreneurial in spirit and are risk-taking are able to find ways to thrive in this environment.
Yeah, I'm sure it's happening. It's hard to, if I were to take myself back to the 1930s, I think it would have had a difficult time seeing that things like Krispy Kreme donuts, which came out back then, or ballpoint pens, or nylons, or
Teflon, yes.
Yeah, Teflon came out back then. A lot of these products, which didn't seem to be a big deal, eventually did become big industries for America. The radio business boomed back then, and sports industry grew. That's an industry which we have to see how it's going to change. Rick knows more about that. But I'm sure it's happening. It's just really hard to observe in real time what those things are. But you can count on the ingenuity of America, the American economy to produce, and the people in the economy to produce all these new things. And that's ultimately where the growth comes from. As Dean said early in this program, we were in the longest expansion in U.S. history, over 10 years, up to 125 months or so of economic growth. Unemployment rate was down between 3.5% and 4%. The stock market was signaling great expectations for the U.S. economy. I disagree with Dean that recessions have to die of old age. They don't have to. I saw us continuing to grow and grow. And I think we'll get back to that tech-led expansion pretty quickly here, because we have a lot of money to net worth. American net worth, assets minus liabilities, is $110 trillion. That's a lot of money for investors to pour into new ventures, some of which will work and many of which will fail, but we'll get a lot of new stuff coming out of this. You can be sure of
it. The thing is that capitalism is very efficient about, or at least puts it's a search for different ways to find out to please consumers and provide what they want. And this is all driven by the consumer and not necessarily by the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur finds the consumer need. So.
Exactly.
All right. We've gone an hour already, and so that was our scheduled time. And what I'd like to give each of you one last word, if you want to say something, and I'd like to point you back towards Texas and the recovery, and whether we can be optimistic that the Texas model will continue to be the best way for this state to remain one of the most prosperous in the nation.
Okay. I guess I'll go first. I do think that there's room for optimism. And I feel like we've talked about that a good bit. So I have some things in my notes I haven't gotten to yet that are actually the opposite side of that. I just want to highlight a few things where Texas faces some challenges. Texas is one of only 7 states that has what we call a business margins tax. It's a form of a gross receipts tax. It basically levies taxes regardless of whether you're making a profit or not, as opposed to a corporate income tax. And there's been lots written about this and that we should get rid of it. And there's been efforts to do so. But that's one kind of burden that we face coming out of this, where we compare back states. Of course, lacking a personal income tax probably outweighs all that. Another area where of reform lately is in occupational licensing. Currently, about 1 in 3 jobs in this country require a license, whereas back in the 1950s, it was like 1 in 20. And so much of the increase in these has been driven essentially by where existing providers want to protect themselves from competition. A bunch of states have started moving in this regard. Texas has kind of lagged behind. And so what some states have done is gotten rid of ones that don't make any sense. For example, here in Texas, we're one of only 7 states to license animal control officers. We're one of only 14 to license locksmiths. Things like that, where there's really not a public safety risk per se. And by the way, it takes 10 times longer in Texas to become a licensed cosmetologist or barber than it does to become an EMT. So getting rid of some of those burdensome restrictions that are particularly burdensome on lower skilled workers, right? So there's an ability with this issue to get agreement from people on all sorts of different places on the ideological spectrum. And what Arizona and Missouri have done, Missouri just last week, I think, have done what's called licensing reciprocity. It's where essentially they say, look, if you got a license to be a barber in Texas and you moved to Missouri, we're going to acknowledge that license. right? So we're going to allow you to basically, a license is a permission to work, right? We're going to allow you to work here and cut hair, even though you don't have the Missouri form of the license. A lot of states have in recent weeks relax these requirements on medical workers, of course, to allow to get medical workers to come from other states and help deal with the crisis. But it's the sort of thing that we ought to probably move forward with to allow essentially freedom, to allow individual workers, especially those with lower skills, to be able to apply their trade and earn a living absent some sort of excessive government restrictions.
It's always a good reminder that as much as we boast about Texas economic freedom, we could always become a more free economy. Michael?
Right, hold on. I want to just pick up on that. As I like to say, we grade on a curve. Texas does great, but you can always do better.
There you go.
Okay, well, I would like to take this question about the Texas economy in two parts, because Texas, as we know, we talked about, is being hit with a 1-2 punch. One punch being that of COVID, like the rest of the nation, and the other one being oil. Let me begin with oil. And when I was at the Dallas Fed in the late 1980s, we had some people from the ministers of parliament, the United Kingdom, came to us and wanted to talk about how did Texas recover so quickly from the massive oil price decline we had in the oil shock. What did you do? And they were saying, what kind of economic policies do you employ? What did you guys do? And we said, nothing. We just let the state reorganize itself, and we let the new industries emerge, and we let the new industries grow. When in 1948 in Texas, oil revenues from the oil fields as a share of the entire state personal income were 25%. It got down as low as 1% in 1998 as the oil sector shrunk in Texas before we got fracking, yet Texas boomed during that time as we had the tech boom and some other, Texas continued to grow. Today, Texas's non-oil economy is 19 times as large as it was in 1948 when oil's share of state income peaked. So oil today is a relatively small portion. Now, oil revenues as a share of income did grow from 1% to about 8%, but that peaked in 14, and we're down now to about 6.5% because prices have fell in, starting in 15. So believe it or not, and the folks from New York don't believe it, but it's true. Oil is not, they think we're completely dependent on oil. Not so. We're a very diversified state now. We've become a lot more like the rest of the nation, which brings me to the second part. We're more likely to suffer the cycle of the rest of the nation today than we did back then. But there's a good reason to believe we won't suffer it as deeply as the nation. And that's because we are exactly what Dean just said. We're more of a free market state, and companies are still moving here. This is still the place to be. If you want to get out of the proximity economy where you walk by somebody, hundreds of people a day on the streets of New York, you can move here, and people are still moving here. And I think you're going to see Texas actually do quite nicely after we get out of this over the next, say, 5 years.
Well, thank you very much. I want to remind everyone that this has been recorded. If you want to recommend it to someone else, or you want to look at it again, I think it will be available on the O'Neill Center website, although I am not in charge of technology here.
O'NeillCenter.org.
Yes, O'NeillCenter.org. And I hope we've enjoyed this discussion. I want to thank my colleagues, Dean Stanzel and Mike Cox, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. I'll see you guys out there.